The outfit. Chicago, 1920s. In 1920, the United States government made one of the most consequential mistakes in its history. It banned alcohol. What followed wasn't sobriety. It was the birth of modern organized crime. Chicago became ground zero, and at the center of it all was a 26-year-old from Brooklyn named Alphonse Capone. Capone didn't invent the Chicago underworld. He inherited it, and then he did something no criminal before him had thought to do at scale. He stopped thinking like a gangster and started thinking like a CEO. The Chicago outfit didn't just sell alcohol, it controlled the entire supply chain. Breweries, trucks, warehouses, speakeasies, and the politicians who looked the other way. At its peak, the outfit was pulling in the equivalent of roughly $1.3 billion a year in today's money. Capone had 700 gunmen on payroll. He owned judges, he owned police captains. The city's mayor, William Hale Thompson, was so thoroughly in Capone's pocket that Chicagoans openly called him Big Bill the Builder, because every favor he granted seemed to build Capone's empire a little higher. The violence was surgical. The 1929 St. Valentine's Day massacre, where 7 members of a rival gang were lined up against a garage wall and executed, wasn't random brutality. It was a message delivered in the language that Chicago's underworld understood perfectly. After that morning, no one seriously challenged the outfit again. But here is what makes the outfit genuinely terrifying. When Capone was finally imprisoned in 1931 for tax evasion, the single most powerful law enforcement takedown of the era, the organization didn't skip a beat. There was no power vacuum, no civil war. The machine simply promoted the next man. The outfit ran Chicago's criminal underworld for another 5 decades after Capone. It had become something beyond a gang. It had become an institution, one that was bigger, older, and more patient than any individual law enforcement career. The Sinaloa Cartel, Mexico, 1980s. There is a mountain range in northwestern Mexico called the Sierra Madre Occidental. It is remote, brutal terrain. Steep valleys, almost no roads, and communities so isolated from the federal government that for generations the only economy that made sense was the one that didn't require infrastructure. Poppy fields, marijuana plantations, and eventually cocaine. Out of this landscape came the Sinaloa Cartel, and out of the Sinaloa Cartel came Joaquin Archivaldo Guzman Loera, El Chapo. What Guzman built wasn't simply a drug trafficking organization. It was a logistics empire disguised as one. The cartel constructed a network of tunnels beneath the U.S.-Mexico border, so sophisticated that some of them had rail systems, ventilation, and electricity. One tunnel discovered in San Diego in 2011 stretched nearly 600 meters. When authorities found it, they recovered 20 tons of marijuana in a single seizure. That was one tunnel. Investigators believed there were dozens more they hadn't found. When El Chapo was captured and placed in Altiplano, Mexico's most secure federal prison in 2014, the government believed it was over. 18 months later, they found a tunnel entrance hidden beneath the shower drain in his cell. The tunnel ran more than a mile through solid earth, had a modified motorcycle on rails for transportation, and had taken an estimated team of engineers over a year to construct without anyone noticing. He walked out. The Sinaloa cartel hadn't paused a single operation while engineering his escape. At its height, the DEA estimated the cartel controlled between 25 and 30% of all drug imports into the United States. The revenue figures were so large that when authorities raided a Sinaloa-linked cash house in Mexico City in 2007, they found $205 million in physical cash stacked in a single residence. That wasn't their money. That was just the cash they hadn't moved yet. El Chapo was eventually recaptured and is currently serving a life sentence in a U.S. maximum security prison. The Sinaloa cartel has never stopped operating. The Yakuza, Japan, 17th century to present. In almost every country on Earth, organized crime hides. It operates in backrooms, uses code words, and moves through shadows. In Japan for most of the 20th century, the largest criminal syndicate in the country had its headquarters listed in the phone book. The Yamaguchi Gumi, the dominant faction of the Yakuza, operated out of a compound in Kobe with a nameplate on the front gate. Members carried business cards identifying their rank within the organization. When new bosses were appointed, the ceremonies were covered in local newspapers. This wasn't arrogance, it was calculated. The Yakuza understood something that most criminal organizations never grasped. Visibility, when paired with genuine community power, is protection. At its peak in the early 1960s, the Yakuza counted over 180,000 members across Japan. They controlled construction contracts, real estate, entertainment, and finance. Politicians sought their endorsement. Corporations paid them to resolve labor disputes. Banks processed their money. But the moment that revealed the true depth of the Yakuza's power didn't happen in a boardroom or a back alley. It happened on January 17, 1995, when a magnitude 6.9 earthquake struck Kobe and killed over 6,000 people in 20 seconds. Within hours, while the Japanese government was still trying to mobilize a response, Yakuza organizations had deployed their own trucks, opened their own warehouses, and were distributing food, water, and blankets to survivors. They did the same thing again after the 2011 Tohoku earthquake and tsunami. The Yakuza moved faster than the state. In the neighborhoods that mattered most to them, they always did. Japanese law enforcement has spent decades dismantling them. Membership has fallen to roughly 24,000 today. But the infrastructure they built, the relationships, the loyalty, the economic dependency, doesn't disappear when a membership card is revoked. In certain parts of Japan, that is still quietly understood. The 'Ndrangheta, Calabria, Italy. For most of the 20th century, the Sicilian Mafia was the name the world feared. The 'Ndrangheta was the organization everyone overlooked. That was the greatest mistake European law enforcement ever made. The 'Ndrangheta emerged from Calabria, the toe of Italy's boot. It was poor, rural, and considered by outsiders to be unsophisticated compared to the Sicilian Cosa Nostra. While Italy poured resources into dismantling the Sicilian Mafia throughout the 1980s and 1990s, the 'Ndrangheta quietly built something far more dangerous. Today, Italian prosecutors estimate the 'Ndrangheta controls between 25 and 30% of Europe's entire cocaine supply. Its annual revenue is estimated at 53 billion euros. To put that in context, that figure exceeds the GDP of some European nations. But the money is almost secondary to the structure. Unlike every other criminal organization on this list, the 'Ndrangheta built its empire entirely on blood. Membership is not purchased. It is not earned through violence or loyalty. It is inherited. You are born into it, or you marry into it. Sons, brothers, cousins, fathers-in-law. The entire organization is one vast, interlocking family tree. This single design decision made the 'Ndrangheta almost impossible to infiltrate. There is no stranger who can be turned. There is no ambitious outsider who can be recruited and then flipped by law enforcement. Every person inside the organization has a biological reason to protect every other person. Undercover operations that dismantled other criminal groups one informant at a time simply had no entry point here. Italian anti-mafia prosecutors have publicly called it the most dangerous criminal organization on the planet. Most people outside of Italy have never heard its name. That anonymity was never an accident. The Golden Triangle. Southeast Asia. Most criminal empires are built by criminals. This one was built by a government decision, and the consequences are still unfolding today. After the Chinese Civil War ended in 1949, thousands of defeated nationalist soldiers retreated into the jungles of Burma rather than surrender. They were stranded, cut off from supply lines, and slowly starving. The CIA, desperate for a proxy force to destabilize communist China along its southern border, made a decision. They would fund these soldiers, and when funding proved insufficient, they would look the other way while those soldiers funded themselves through the only industry the remote highlands could support: opium. The Golden Triangle, the mountainous region where Myanmar, Laos, and Thailand converge, became the world's largest opium-producing region almost overnight. At its peak, it was responsible for roughly 70% of the global heroin supply. Entire highland economies were restructured around the poppy harvest. Out of this landscape rose men like Kun Sa, a warlord who by the 1980s commanded a private army of over 20,000 soldiers, controlled territory larger than some European countries, and ran his own taxation system, currency, and foreign policy. In 1987, Kun Sa contacted the U.S. government with an offer. He would sell them his entire opium crop for $50 million so it could be destroyed. The U.S. government declined. He surrendered to Burmese authorities in 1996, and died peacefully in Rangoon in 2007. Never extradited, never tried. The infrastructure his empire built, the smuggling corridors, the corrupted border officials, the farming communities with no alternative economy, outlasted him entirely. The Golden Triangle still produces a significant share of the world's heroin. The decision made in a CIA office in the early 1950s never stopped paying its consequences. The Zetas, Mexico, late 1990s. Every organization on this list took decades to build. The Zetas took years. They did it by doing something no cartel had ever attempted. They didn't recruit criminals, they recruited soldiers. The founding members of the Zetas were not street gang veterans or drug runners. They were an elite unit of approximately 30 Mexican Special Forces soldiers, trained in counterinsurgency, intelligence gathering, and airborne operations, who defected to work as the enforcement arm of the Gulf Cartel in the late 1990s. They brought military discipline, tactical doctrine, and weapons procurement networks with them. Almost immediately, the balance of power in Mexican organized crime shifted. Within a decade, the Zetas had broken from the Gulf Cartel entirely and built their own empire across northeastern Mexico. But what made them different from every cartel that came before was their deliberate use of terror as an operational strategy, not random violence. Engineered fear. The Zetas pioneered the use of mass public executions, roadside displays, and eventually social media broadcasts of extreme violence, specifically designed to paralyze civilian populations and eliminate any rational incentive to cooperate with authorities. The calculation was precise. If the cost of speaking to law enforcement was high enough and visible enough, the information would stop flowing. Entire towns in Tamaulipas and Veracruz were effectively abandoned as residents fled rather than live inside Zeta territory. Mexican military operations eventually fractured their leadership structure through the 2000s. But the template the Zetas created, the merger of genuine military training with cartel logistics, the systematic use of public terror as a governing tool, did not die with their organization. It became an inheritance. Armed groups across Latin America, and increasingly beyond, have studied what the Zetas built and taken notes.